Thank you to Jesse for organising this event and for inviting Birgit and I to give this joint paper. And thanks also to Marie for her talk. It was extremely useful and interesting. As Jesse mentioned, historians are quite new to this topic, and we're in some ways learning the kinds of historical questions that we need to ask. And I'm not quite sure that we'll have all the answers today, but hopefully this will be the start of a useful dialogue. So the aim for us is to sketch what is actually a very complicated medical scientific landscape in Britain and in West Germany in the half century or so before hormone pregnancy tests came onto the market. As Jesse has said, it's really important we understand the historical conditions in which this drug was prescribed and consumed, potential risks identified and responded to. Time is very short, so these surveys are necessarily partial and incomplete. But we thought it would be most useful to start by giving a sense of the context in which risks to the developing fetus were understood by medical practitioners and scientists in the half century or so before the 1950s. So put another way, what kinds of medical practitioners and disciplines were active in research into and the management of the class of conditions we now term birth defects? Who were the key experts? These questions are, in fact, deceptively simple. Expertise in human malformations is, even today, the exclusive preserve of no single discipline or specialism. Rather, across this long period, clinical engagement with birth defects has been defined by a constellation of activities almost constantly in flux, characterized by social fluidity and uncertainty. The field can be perceived as caught in an almost permanent state of emergence and transformation. At the same time, medical approaches to birth defects have depended on wider changes in the organization of health services and medical technology and regulatory cultures. So a quick word on periodization. The 20th century history of pregnancy and a risk of birth defects is inevitably dominated by thalidomide, the most infamous of the so-called teratogenic drugs. As John Abraham's work has shown us, the thalidomide disaster is often assumed to be a kind of inflection point in the history of drug regulation, but this is only partially true. The same might be said of medical activity around birth defects. There's a longer story of disciplinary, intellectual, and political reconfigurations and negotiations, which are only beginning to reconstruct. So part of that story is about the emergence and growing significance of clinical genetics as a medical specialism compared to the relative marginality of teratology, the field broadly concerned with non-familial, environmentally caused prenatal conditions. So both Birgit and I will be considering the central question for Great Britain and West Germany. So let's start with Britain in the early to mid 20th century. And the situation here might be summarized in terms of the division of labor between different clinical disciplines. Obstetricians and gynecologists were involved in the investigation of miscarriages, aborted and pathological fetuses and stillbirths, as well as part of broad concerns with neonatal and maternal mortality and morbidity. So this kind of activity is perhaps best captured by the work of the Medical Research Council, MRC's Child Life Investigation Committee. So this is established in 1919 and continues to around 1930, led by obstetric largely consultants and pediatric consultants in both London and in Scotland. The particular sort of focus of this work was congenital syphilis, the influence of syphilis on the fetus and pregnancy. On the other hand, there's a range of clinical disciplines, notably pediatricians, psychiatrists, surgeons, hematologists, involved with the management of hereditary conditions, and the clinical care of malformations of the newborn and of children. So human geneticists are more modestly involved with research into these conditions. And the locus of this work is London, the London Specialist Hospitals, the UCL Galton Laboratory, and also the Eugenics Society. So moving forward to the post-World War II period, there's relatively little attention to environmental or exogenous congenital conditions throughout this early period, but more so, much more so, after the recognition that maternal infection with rubella or German measles during pregnancy was linked or could be linked to miscarriage, infant death, and a range of serious disabilities, and especially deaf blindness. So the possibility that viral infections may be teratogenic prompted a major Ministry of Health inquiry, a study designed by the GRO, the General Register Office, which leads to a report in 1960. And this is really the first time that there's serious consideration of environmental causes of congenital disabilities in Britain from a state point of view. More generally, this gives rise to the emerging field of the epidemiology of congenital malformations and what's generally called reproductive wastage. In particular, interest in regional, seasonal, and socioeconomic factors in these conditions. So this emerges from a more general concern about the growing proportion of infant deaths attributed to hereditary or congenital malformations as infant mortality in general came down in the period around World War II. So much research comes in particular out of the new Department of Social Medicine established at Birmingham. Historians will know the work of Thomas McEwen, who's very involved in this new field. But also through the work of a major post-war perinatal mortality survey sponsored by the charity the National Birthday Trust Fund from 1958. So one of the major outcomes of this work was a much greater appreciation of the regional variations in incidence of congenital malformations. Much of it is assumed to be sort of socio-economic in background. But this sort of coincides with the development of new specialist pediatric services and new clusters of activity in clinical genetics, especially in the northwest region, Liverpool, Manchester, Leeds, and also in Wales. So the headline story in the emergence of clinical genetics is in the developing field of human cytogenetics, which came to the fore in the context of the mutational effects of radiation after Hiroshima. So most important were new techniques of human karyotyping, visualizing human chromosomes and its applications in clinical research and practice. And in particular, the description of links between chromosomal anomalies and birth defects. So this work is concentrated in particular in MRC and Nuffield-funded research facilities. But the role of specialist geneticists in the clinic is still relatively marginal in the 1950s. Around this time, so note this is before thalidomide, the prevention of birth defects is starting to crystallize as a public health goal. So the first international conference on congenital malformations, held in London in 1958, announced a shift in focus of the major US medical charity, the National Foundation, or March of Dimes, from polio to birth defects. Much more modestly in the UK, the MRC established a working group on congenital defects to consider the various issues in this field as early as 1958. So enter thalidomide. Initiatives in this area were very much overtaken by events. So this sedative morning sickness drug was withdrawn in November '62, shortly after its teratogenicity was established. This was, of course, a high-profile medical media scandal. So combined with rubella epidemics in the early 1960s, the disaster was a key factor in increasing pressure to liberalize abortion laws in the UK and elsewhere in the 60s onwards. So thalidomide very much consolidates interest in the causes of and prevention of birth defects. But it's important to say that teratology as a field remained weakly established, poorly funded, and resolutely clinical. In other words, it dominated by clinical practitioners, specialisms, and especially pediatrics. So this gives impetus to the institution of new systems of surveillance, first local, then national, and then transnational. Although the first registry of congenital malformations was preceded thalidomide, it was founded in Liverpool in 1960. So this was initiated by the pediatrician Richard Smithers, who had become the leading British expert on congenital defects. He'd also go on to play a major role in thalidomide litigation, and as I understand it, also as an expert witness acting for Shearing in the Primodos lawsuit. He's also a prominent figure in the MRC study group, founded to coordinate clinical research into human malformations in 1963. So the irony is that the thalidomide disaster was arguably more consequential for the expansion and institution of clinical genetics than the consolidation of teratology as a field of research. It's important, for instance, in reforming the abortion law. So we know that from the 70s, we see a rapid extension of regional genetic services in the UK, organised in particular around prenatal diagnosis and screening with therapeutic abortion and genetic counselling. And there are important new centres in the northwest, in Liverpool and Manchester, also in Edinburgh and Glasgow in Scotland. So genetic services, it's important to say, that were consolidated within the hospital-dominated political economy after the NHS reforms and reorganisations of the 1970s. And these new services fit, in particular, the new logic of prevention in medicine and public health around this time, which emerges as a key priority of health service reform during the 70s. So put bluntly, genetic services and what was termed prevention of handicap were protected and promoted on cost-benefit grounds. So as clinical genetics was integrated increasingly into the new health services, teratology remains marginal, acknowledged as a difficult, challenging field, and it's indicative that the first preventive teratology unit is only founded in 1977 in London. So before I hand over to Birgit, I just wanted to have a look at the composition of some of the expert working groups that I mentioned, that give an indication of the kind of changing balance of disciplines involved in expertise and research on questions around teratology across this general period. So the first is the Ministry of Health inquiry, a working party on viral infections during pregnancy, especially rubella. The second, a relatively sort of short-term working group established by the MRC. And finally, as a working party, a study group that's established in the immediate wake of thalidomide. So as you can see from the sort of the balance of expertise, that teratology has always been a field in general that has attracted an extremely disparate range of experts and disciplines. So around rubella, there's expertise in pediatrics, medical statistics, obstetrics, clinical sort of ophthalmology, neonatology, and to some extent microbiology and virology. This sort of shifts around 57. The weight of expertise in epidemiology, and And then in 63, the expert groups were also drawing on general practitioners, experts in neonatal medicine and physiology, but very little presence of commentators on or experts in pharmacology. So this gives a sense of the wide range of expertise that's involved in this field. Very good. Thank you very much.